Mr. McMahon, the Netflix documentary about the life and times of Vince McMahon was released today, and we've watched it, so maybe you don't have to. Jack and I have dived deep into this today.
We have.
I'm a little bit shell-shocked from it all, to be honest.
We're going to take a bit of a look at everything that's said in the documentary, everything you need to know. And we're going to take a look at the response to it and everything, and whether or not we feel it's been reported that it's a hit piece on Vince, but then other places have reported that it doesn't go deep enough on Vince. We're going to take a general overall look, see what we think, and talk about some of the more noteworthy things that came to light in the documentary.
We'll go episode by episode on it as well. There's the story that we talked about in the news earlier today from Matthew Baloney of Puck, and he reported that Vince actually tried to buy the documentary after he'd seen the direction in which it was being produced, and he also put out a statement beforehand that's called into question the way that it was put together, which suggests that Vince McMahon wasn't overly happy with the documentary and the portrayal of him in there. There's also a few others, one in particular being Bruce Pritchard, who later on, as the series goes on, reveals that he himself wasn't happy with the way that the show was initially put together as well.
So the story from Puck would imply that it's a very negative portrayal of Vince if he was going to try and buy it and essentially bury the documentary before it came to light. But then there were conflicting reports from some outlets that had advance access to it before we all saw the documentary. In particular, the review from Men's Journal, which took very much the opposite view and implied that it didn't criticize Vince enough. So I thought this was worth mentioning as a counterpoint to the story of Vince trying to buy it. Men's Journal say, with every controversy that's covered, Vince gives his version of events and then flatly denies any wrongdoing, and that's it. I don't know if the producers were too scared to ask McMahon the tough questions or if he refused to answer them, but almost no attempt is made to get him to take accountability for anything that's happened. The result is a series where a topic is introduced, Vince gives his perspective, and then they cut to another interviewee, usually wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer, to give the opposing perspective. There's no discussion, no interrogation of the facts, just stating both sides of the argument and then moving on. I wanted to ask you there, do you agree with that assessment?
I do, because it's not just a case of they cut to somebody else talking about it. There's many cases throughout this documentary where they use the trope that, Vince McMahon will say, I've never eaten an apple, and then there'll be a clip of Vince eating an apple. Like, that is quite a common thing that we see, at least, especially later on into the documentary, as a way of telling the story without, as it seems, challenging Vince McMahon on a lot of the things that he says, and quite a lot of the things that he says and a few other people say are brought into question throughout the entire thing.
I would say maybe I take issue with Men's Journal there because it says there's no like sort of deep criticism of Vince at all, whereas I think, as you've explained there, there's no explicit calling out of Vince, but there's a presentation of contrasting opinions. There's a presentation of, well, sometimes they edit it in such a way that he is being contradicted as he speaks by the images that are overlaid on the screen as he's talking. So I think there's a lot of implicit criticism of Vince, which if you watch it, comes across very clearly. So I lie somewhere in the middle. I don't think it's a total hit piece on Vince. I think they could have gone a lot harder, but at the same time, I don't think they're letting him off the hook.
And also, it's worth pointing out the main reason why this documentary is so intriguing is because of the events of this year and of course of 2023 with the allegations regarding Vince McMahon. Now, these allegations came out as they were in some cases halfway through filming, but for a lot of people had already wrapped and were already in post-production with.
And they made that very clear. They flashed up a disclaimer towards the start of episode 1 saying most of these interviews took place before those allegations came to light, which they have to do, obviously. Otherwise, a lot of people would look very, very silly indeed. It's worth mentioning that the bulk of it, from sort of at the start of episode 1, the allegations are mentioned on screen, and then episode 6 deals more thoroughly with the allegations. The rest of the documentary presents controversial instances throughout the history of WWE and Vince's life, but it kind of maybe a lot of it is stuff that we as wrestling fans are already at least familiar with.
Yeah, you're going to watch this. If you watch us on a regular basis, and thank you for doing so, we appreciate you so much. But if you do, then there's a load of stuff in here that you will already know. A lot of stories about the rise of the Golden Era, the Attitude Era, Steve Austin, The Rock, the creation of the character of Mr. McMahon that we already know. But we have the luxury of knowing all this, and we're able to sort of go into the weeds a little bit and find out stuff and put connections together on other things and cross-section other things that we didn't know before today. and we're going to go. Should we dive in?
I was just going to mention before we go in episode
sure.
by episode that I think there'll be a lot of response to this documentary coming out, and I think there'll be two very different responses from wrestling fans versus people who have no idea about wrestling at all. I think that wrestling fans may feel like it doesn't go deep enough or thorough enough on the history of WWE. They've had to condense the entire history of WWE basically under Vince Jr.'s helm into like essentially 6-hour-long episodes. It's not enough time to fully explore all the ins and outs of WWE's history. But at the same time, I think that non-wrestling fans might see this as kind of far more shocking and revealing a lot more than wrestling fans would, because they might have no idea about it. I compared it to you like everyone felt watching Tiger King.
Yes.
The vast majority of Tiger King's audience on Netflix had no idea about the inner workings of the tiger keeping community in the United States. And therefore it was very shocking and very bizarre, whereas it wouldn't have been so much of a surprise to those who are in that industry or are familiar with it. I think that non-wrestling fans who watch this documentary will be blown away by all the controversy and everything, even if to us, as seasoned wrestling fans, it might not seem too deep. So bear that in mind when we see the responses pop up in the next few days. I think non-wrestling fans are going to have a very different view of this to wrestling fans.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Episode 1, which they've called Junior, which I don't think he'll be very happy about, to be honest with you. It was never a name that he particularly resonated with. But.
No. And the very start of episode 1 is the until episode 6 is the only sort of part of the documentary that deals with the allegations that emerged this year about Vince McMahon. So we've got the opening shot of Vince getting into the ring for his interview, sitting in a chair. And I thought it perhaps came across quite vulnerable and undignified. And I think that was a deliberate choice made since the allegations came out. They kind of immediately, you're against him, I think, or you're meant to look at him as kind of old and pitiful, I suppose. That's how I read it anyway. He then says something very interesting, which I assume he thought was going to be cut out, which is a quote where he says, "I wish I could tell you the real stories. Holy S word." And that implies, even in this deep dive into his own life and everything, he's going to try and keep some things secret. Again, I think it immediately sets us against Vince McMahon. We think, well, everything we hear from him for the next 6 episodes, we're not sure what we can trust.
There's a disclaimer towards the start, by the way, about the allegations, and the majority of the interview footage being shot, as we've said before, the Wall Street Journal story broke. And I think it's worth putting that into perspective. After a cut point, we get Triple H. He takes issue with, this is a big part of, as we kind of get into it, the stereotype of wrestling fans being too stupid to realize that it's fake. It's a comment made by Paul Levesque. He defines wrestling fans as actually smart enough to realize that it's a show.
Yeah, he takes the opposite view. He says wrestling fans aren't stupid. They're the ones smart enough to realize it's a show. We have to bear in mind as we watch this that obviously Raw is about to head to Netflix. WWE and Netflix are going to be working together, and this may be I don't know if flattery is the right word, but Triple H presenting this new attitude as opposed to the old Carney stereotype of we're working all the marks. Now it's a collaboration with the fans. You know, they're part of the show and everything.
And it kind of bleeds into what we think is the real point of this documentary, which we'll talk about right at the very end.
Okay.
I think I know why they've done it this way.
Interesting. I'm excited to hear what you think. It's the first episode is basically the story of Vince's. There's a brief bit on Vince's childhood and not knowing his father until he was 12 years old, and then going into business with him, working for the WWF, then buying it from his dad. And the episode covers the explosion of the WWF or the WWE, taking out the territories, Hulkamania, the rise of that, the big success of WrestleMania 1, the big success of WrestleMania 3. An interesting bit I found in episode 1 was Vince talking about the foreign heel trope in wrestling, where he paints it as a relic of the past and something that would never fly today. But it's an early example in this documentary of Vince defending his position. So he says, you can look back on anything then and say, oh, I bet you regret that. Well, 10 years, 20 years, even 5 years ago, life was different then. Values were different. And you can't take the values of today and look back and say the same values apply. If it were done today, wow, that would be a problem. Vince McMahon saying, stereotypical gimmicks today, that would be a problem. When not that long ago at all, we had that story of Jinder Mahal coming out and saying, yeah, Vince made me cut a promo on Nakamura that I was so uncomfortable with.
That really was, in the grand scheme of things, fairly recent as well. And I think it says that, oh, no, that wouldn't fly today. But I think had he still been in the helmet, it wouldn't be for the one to try in.
That's when he's talking about the Iron Sheik and then getting the belt onto Hulk Hogan.
Because he revealed in it as well that one of the original ideas that he wanted for this new person to take the lead for this global expansion of wrestling was Dusty Rhodes.
Yes.
That might have been already out there, but that was certainly something that was new to me. And the fact that Dusty was a consideration to be the Hulk Hogan.
And they kind of portrayed it as Dusty didn't really want it.
He didn't see what Vince McMahon Jr. was doing was viable. So they kind of moved on to Hulk Hogan, who had been sacked in years before for having the audacity to go and do the Rocky film.
Yeah. Episode 1 isn't the most... the audacity is right.
Audacity!
Episode 1 isn't the most explosive in terms of scandals or controversies. That comes later on. Episode 1 is kind of the most celebratory episode of all of them. And he's saying like, look how well they did. They rose and everything, and they beat the territories. They don't skirt over the fact that Vince was very brutal in his business tactics against the territories. But there's a bit of a window possibly, or this might be what they're trying to get across, into Vince's psyche, where he talks about finally making his dad proud when he started to beat the territories, and specifically mentions that the only time Vince Sr. said he loved him was the day before he died. We see Vince get quite emotional when he's talking about this. And then we immediately get a hard cut to Tony Atlas going, I don't think Vince liked his dad at all. So
Tony Atlas has some moments throughout this documentary.
God, he does, yeah.
He talks. They reference the Pat Patterson scandals and such
a bit later on.
And then he immediately cuts to a story that completely flies in the face of what he just said seconds before.
I mentioned that later on in these notes. But yeah, that's an early example of kind of the docu-series doing what Men's Journal critiqued them for in that piece beforehand, which is presenting Vince's point of view, then presenting an alternative point of view. And the Men's Journal article argues this doesn't criticize Vince enough. It's just presenting two different things. But I think the fact that they've edited it in such a way where we see someone immediately challenge Vince's view and immediately insinuate that he's lying, I think it does implicitly critique him in a way.
But I think it would have been more intriguing as a consumer to have had those moments where the interview kind of holds Vince's feet over the coals a bit more.
Presses him a bit more.
Kind of presses him a bit more on.
Yeah.
So, not to say that didn't happen, but we're basing it on what we have seen in the documentary that we have here.
And it's also quite apparent that from the moment, kind of early in episode 1, where they've said these allegations came out, the bulk of this was recorded before the allegations took place. And then this first episode, and a lot of the rest of the episodes as well, is clearly the documentary that they had already made before the allegations came out. They probably had to scramble a lot with episode 6, which we'll get to in a bit.
They go into WrestleMania 3, the third in the history of a pay-per-view that Vince McMahon came up with while he was on a 2-day holiday, which they said...
In the Caribbean. He said, I went somewhere in the Caribbean. Linda told me you need to take a vacation.
2 days.
And then afterwards she accused him, you weren't relaxing on vacation at all. And Vince kind of goes, just kind of makes a noise. All right, okay.
But there was a lot of concern about this main event of WrestleMania 3, at least from Hulk Hogan's perspective.
Yes, this is episode 2, which talks about WrestleMania 3, and then we get into all the scandals that fell down upon WWE shortly after it. So they've kind of... I've heard this story before. I don't know if I've ever seen Vince and Hogan talk about it directly, but they talk about Hogan being unsure whether Andre was going to put him over in the main event. And I just can't believe it. I just don't think that... The interviewer says to him, so when did you know that Andre was going to put you over when you were going to win? And Hogan went, when the ref counted 3, when the pinfall happened. And I just don't think that's true.
There's something to be said for like the old school boys mentality where like Andre was just a big imposing figure. He could do what he wants and da-da-da-da-da.
Vince says, you can't make Andre do... He's a giant. You can't make him do anything.
But Andre was a bit broken at that point. So you probably could have made him do it.
Yes.
But he, I think it was the mystique of like, he might not do that. But I think it's also there's that same rumor and innuendo, they don't mention it here, that Paul Orndorff was in the wings in the event that Andre couldn't physically compete that night at WrestleMania.
Yeah.
Orndorff was like an understudy for the main event.
Yeah. They talk about what a success WrestleMania 3 was. But then there's an immediate cut to Dave Meltzer calling it a key part of WWE's and Vince McMahon's mythology. The reality is Hogan was already a bigger star than Andre. It wasn't a torch passing moment. He points out that Andre wasn't undefeated as they claimed and had been slammed. They'd done the slam spot, he says, about 20, 25 times before that. There's also the attendance figure stuff where we get a wonderfully cut together part, which has already been shared around Twitter, of various WWE figures, including Vince McMahon, repeating the 93,000 attendance figure. And then Meltzer goes, 78,000.
Yeah.
Not that that's not an astounding amount.
It's still a great attendance
it
figure, but I think it's just the comedy of like 93,000, 93,000, 93,000. That was about 76,000.
And it's another example, I think, of the documentary not wanting you to fully believe one side or the other. Yes, they might not have gone in on Vince as hard as maybe we'd have preferred, but they do at least. I think there's some moments that are designed to make him look at least foolish. The question is that enough to make him look foolish, or do we want to go in a bit more?
Yeah, without a doubt. They talk about WrestleMania 7 later on as well, which of course was the WrestleMania that was moved over what, as they have said, it was fears that there was some sort of attack because of Sergeant Slaughter confessing his support of Saddam Hussein. Mm-hmm. Of course, as we know, the attendance wasn't very good as they went to as well.
No, they kind of admit in the documentary, Vince admits that it didn't really work out, WrestleMania 7. It wasn't that great. He says, he kind of expresses regret over involving a real world conflict going on at that time in the storyline, saying you learn from everything and you have no control over world events, so you have to be very careful associating yourself with events in the real world. Anything can happen, so just don't go there. Again, I think that's very hypocritical from Vince, because over the years we've seen him always in touch with things going on in the real world and never shying away from using real world controversial or political events to kind of mold into his own form of entertainment.
I feel like if they are to his end or to a certain belief that he holds, then yes.
Yeah. I'll do it anyway.
Scandals come up here from the early 90s. Tony Atlas reveals what was going on behind the curtain, saying we would have been looked upon in today's society as some of the worst human beings walking the face of the earth. I mean, we abused the hell out of women. All of us did. They were like a toy for us.
A really shocking quote there from Tony Atlas, who delivers it quite blasé, quite casually as well. Oh yeah, it would be terrible if people knew what we... do you know you're in a documentary?
You're being filmed.
Yeah.
Don't you, Tony?
Bret Hart speaks up as well on the sex scandal. Before I get into what Bret said here, the response from wrestling fans, everybody's loving Bret Hart in this documentary because he just cuts through all the noise. Bret Hart has always been very no nonsense, and I think people enjoy his particular brand of straight talking, but also everyone's been laughing a bit at how much he is a fan of Bret Hart.
Oh gosh, yeah, he is the leader of the Bret Hart fan club on many occasions in this, and he does talk about the scandals within WWE at this point as well.
He says, "I do think there was a lot of turning of a blind eye to some of the things that were going on. I don't think anybody could ever prove anything." There's a little aside I want to mention as well with Jimmy Hart around this time, where it's kind of before he's asked any questions, he's kind of preparing himself to be asked stuff, and he goes, "Yeah, I don't know what I can say. I don't know what they want out there." And they leave that in, him saying that. And then they never really go back to him to talk about it. Yeah. So it's basically, I think, implying that the code of silence from back then, or the alleged code of silence, I suppose, still has a hold to this day.
Yeah, they do mention that later on when they start talking about the allegations and such, this sort of code of silence away from NDAs and such like that. Dave Meltzer claims that Vince told him of 3 mentioned in the sex scandal, being Mel Phillips, Terry Garvin, and Pat Patterson. One was innocent, and it was Pat. This is something that Bruce Pritchard backs up. But then there's an immediate cut to Tony Atlas, who mentions troubling behavior backstage from Pat.
He says, "We all knew Pat was doing this stuff. I didn't like Pat because he kept grabbing my pecker in the locker room." The interviewer goes, "What?" And kind of gets him to elaborate, and then says, "Why didn't you complain to Vince about this?" And he just laughs at the interviewer and says, "You either take it or you're going home. Vince needed Pat more than he needed me." There's now a little bit after this of they're basically demonstrating what a mind for the business Pat Patterson had, and therefore how valuable his innocence would have been to Vince McMahon to have around. We can't get rid of Pat for too long. He's got such a great mind for the business. That's kind of what's implied by the following part.
Richard Chatterton allegations are presented here as well, showing us something that should have resonated far more at the time with the media and the public. But they were seemingly both parties happy to turn a blind eye to the story, and it's something that has come back up again in the wake of the Janelle Grant allegations as well. It seems so surprising surprising. And I think it's mentioned later on as well by the fact that a lot of reporters maybe didn't want to touch it because it was involved in the murky, very fake business of wrestling as it was perceived.
Yeah, so, as you say, both parties, the media and the public as well, that it's implied in the docuseries that the fans just loved the wrestling and didn't want to think too much about what was going on behind the scenes particularly. They'd rather just carry on enjoying it. It also shows, this is a very interesting part, it shows Vince maintaining his innocence with the Rita Chatterton case even now, but then he says something very troubling. He mentions that the statute of limitations has run out anyway, even if he was guilty, which is a bizarre thing to say if you're claiming that you're innocent. Then at the end of the episode, we see text on the screen explaining that after the interview was filmed, the statute of limitations was temporarily lifted in the state of New York and Vince was forced to settle out of court, which says it all, really.
That says quite a lot. They talk about Hulk Hogan leaving the company and exiting to WCW, defecting to World Championship Wrestling, something that Vince says hurt emotionally. He says, it broke my heart.
I thought it was just quite interesting seeing Vince admit that. I don't think I've ever heard of him admit that before.
Because so much of it is like, well, we'll just make a new Hulk Hogan anyway. It'll be fine. And there's a few people that Vince McMahon has got very emotional about when talking about their impact in the business. Normally it's The Undertaker, it's Mark Calloway. You'll see him. There's an infamous gif of Vince McMahon doing this. And that's, I believe, as he's asked about The Undertaker.
Oh, I thought it was Roddy Piper.
Oh, it might have been Piper,
Andre.
then.
It's one of the
WWE. You know what? I think it might have been Andre. But that proves the point, like the fact that it was Andre, Undertaker, and I think Hulk Hogan, another one
big
of those
stars
as well. Big stars,
WWE,
yeah, it was Andre. My apologies.
Shane McMahon also chimes in saying that Hulk Hogan leaving was an enormous slap in the face. Even to this day, that was taboo in my book, he says, which again I thought was interesting because earlier on, I think maybe in episode 1, we get a little glimpse of Shane McMahon talking about how do you think your father wants to be portrayed, or how do you think he's portrayed? And he says, I think my father gets all the attention that he wants. He doesn't say my dad's a victim. He gets a lot. Shane's never that kind about Vince, as kind as you might think he would be as his son. But even he talks about how hurt he was by Hulk Hogan's defection to WCW.
The relationship with Shane and Vince does come up in a later episode as well, to a great extent. The third episode kind of talks about the screw job, the Montreal screw job, among other things.
Yes.
When it comes to the original screw job, Vince McMahon says, I didn't care. Life's not fair sometimes, and I don't fight fair. He says that a lot. Later on, especially, where he just goes, hey, you've got to cheat sometimes to win.
Common themes throughout the documentary are Vince saying he doesn't fight fair, talking about Americana, wrestling is Americana, it's a representation of America. And have you noticed how often Vince says larger than life? It's larger than life. Everything's larger than life. Just common things that crop up all the time. But yeah, that was Vince talking about the original screw job with Wendy Richter and the Fabulous Moolah, setting up the discussion later on about Bret Hart, of course. We're still in the trial at this point as well, the steroid trial. Various wrestlers echo Hulk Hogan's steroid trial sentiments, where he said that Vince never offered him steroids. He basically was a key witness and helped the defense massively in that trial. And then we see Tony Atlas and Bret Hart, two people who don't speak always that kindly about Vince, but also backing up the idea that Vince never told them to take steroids. Then we get an immediate opposing view from Dave Meltzer, who says that Vince would kind of tell people to work out harder, though. He wasn't exactly saying, you don't need steroids. He's just saying, oh, you work out a lot, work out a bit more, and kind of fostered the culture, cultivated this sort of environment, I suppose, where it was implicitly encouraged.
It was intimated. It was implicitly encouraged as opposed to said outright.
Mm-hmm. Vince wasn't convicted, and nor should he have been, said Meltzer, but he wasn't the good guy. And the documentary seems to push this opinion that while Vince wasn't guilty and shouldn't have been found guilty in that specific instance, the trial did still expose that the promotion had a serious steroid problem, and that Vince being found innocent didn't clear him either of the various other scandals and accusations cropping up around that time.
It's in that bit, I think, where you've got Hulk Hogan, an interview he did on Arsenio Hall, where he went, I've never taken steroids. And then it's just cut to people going, yeah, you did, yeah. I actually injected him with someone's like...
And it cuts to Vince saying like he really didn't help us out when he did that, and it cuts to Hogan himself saying that was a huge balls up on my part. I should have lied or not gone on the show at all.
Yeah, Vince admitted in the documentary that he was worried when Nitro went head-to-head with Raw and thought they could put his company out of business. It's funny, what myself and Jack Atkins do the Cultaholic Classic Raw review every Monday on the podcast feed. So we've been watching Raw week to week, and we've seen how Raw has changed since Nitro was included.
Okay.
And those little things, like the one thing that comes through this as well in terms of Vince's character is that he will defend and then he will attack. And sometimes it's very physical. And you see that in the way that Raw was put together as Nitro came through. So when he said, oh yeah, I was worried, like, well, that was as much as you put the bravado up, it was clear that you were.
It was actually affecting him. They talk a bit about the billionaire Ted skits with and then apparently the head of the USA Network stopped him from doing that because she was a friend of Ted Turner's.
Yeah.
She's like, even though we're rivals, we're friends as well, and it's not cool what you're doing. It also highlights in this episode the hypocrisy of Vince complaining about WCW's tactics during the Monday Night Wars when he was very ruthless with the territories in the 80s, as we saw in episode 1. He said, some might think it's hypocritical of me to say, I don't hurt someone else, I just do what's best for me. But when someone comes after me, I don't think they have the right to do that. What I say a lot of the time is totally different to what I think. And the public doesn't understand that sometimes. As a businessman, you have to throw things out there that aren't really the way you feel, but it controls thought process by doing that. You're just saying, I lie all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is basically what's said there. We come to episode 4, and it starts with Vince talking about one of the wrestlers that he idolized when he was growing up, and it was Dr. Jerry Graham, who would light cigars with a $100 note, and he said he wanted to be just like him. And there's clips of Jerry Graham doing his like swag around the ring, which is eerily reminiscent of the Vince McMahon power walk. And there's a few other little elements in there where you think Vince borrowed it from there. And it was just some interesting new information certainly for me and maybe for others, how much of what Mr. McMahon was borrowed sort of in terms of the demeanor from Dr. Jerry Graham. We talk about the Montreal Screwjob here. Triple H saying that the Screwed Brett speech, as we know, was where the character was created. And that's where the lines began to blur. It kind of led to the birth of the Attitude Era. Shawn Michaels, remember when he came out and danced and put what we thought was a sock down his pants? He's revealed it's gauze and said that Vince tried to fine him 10 grand for doing it. And Vince was like, Vince would fine him 10 grand, and Shawn said, well, no, that's what we want to do in it. To which Vince went, yeah, you're right. From now on, we want attitude like Shawn's got.
A very short amount of time after that, Vince was all in on the Attitude Era. Triple H says that Vince spent a long time chastising DX for pushing things, as you mentioned there, until eventually he stopped and it became the norm because it was working and bringing people to the shows.
Now, it comes to the creation of the Mr. McMahon character. And this is something that is certainly a major player in this documentary. Vince says that the character comes from when he was growing up, he was dirt poor, and there were people around him that flaunted their wealth and flaunted their status. And he said that they were the inspiration behind the Mr. McMahon character. And he drew upon that, and he realized how much he loved getting heat from the audience when he did it as well.
And I think this might have been the common thread of the docuseries before the allegations came out. I feel like the takeaway message originally would have been, how much is Mr. McMahon and how much is Vince McMahon? And we get more of that later on, certainly.
Well, we get that immediately, because then we kind of bleeds into that, and Vince McMahon is asked the similarities between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon, and he outright says, oh, there's none. To which Bruce Pritchard, Shane McMahon, Hulk Hogan, and Shawn Michaels go, yeah, they're one and the same, or they're the same person with the volume turned up. And Vince then goes on to say that it always bugs him that people thought that he was the same as Mr. McMahon.
Yeah.
But then there are many accounts throughout this of, like, from Bruce Pritchard in terms of meetings that he's had with Vince, and one very later on with Paul Heyman, which he overheard, which say that actually, I think that Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon, in terms of their demeanor and their character and their carrying themselves, are one and the same.
Yeah, that's one of those very nicely edited contradictions with what Vince is saying versus what's being immediately presented to you. We get another one straight after, as Vince claims, and I'm sure that most people would disagree with this, that WWF in the Attitude Era was still family friendly, with no death, no knives, and no guns. And they cut in turn to shots of a Buried Alive match, The Rock being locked in a casket, Pillman with the gun, and Vince then admitting it's maybe aimed at more of an adult family, not for young kids. So he said it was still family friendly. They flash up all these images that immediately refute that. And then we see Vince going, Sort of.
But they don't seem to take any responsibility for the fact that obviously it's been forever a product that's aimed at kids. They sell action figures, they sell video games and such like that. But and there's clips, of course, of kids dressed in WWF merchandise, wrestling in the house, giving the suck it poses and stuff like that, but there's no real responsibility taken. And they move into the kind of almost seamlessly into the treatment of women in the product. And Shawn Michaels himself admits that now having a daughter himself, that the company could have been less objectionable towards women at the height of its popularity.
Yeah.
They talk more about that. They talk quite extensively about that there.
Yeah. Is this when they talk about Sable, or is that a little bit later?
A bit later on, they come back to Sable.
We also talk about Owen Hart at this point, of course, leading up to the Over the Edge tragedy in 1999. Bret talks about Vince humiliating Owen on TV, believing it to be a way of getting to Bret for leaving for WCW and for the screw job and everything. Vince says that comment in response feeds to Bret's ego, still very much at loggerheads so many decades on from the screw job.
And then I go into Over the Edge 1999. This is something that's been talked about so much, about how this is a show that should not have gone on. They cite the fact that the audience was in a blackout when Owen Hart fell from the ceiling as a reason why they didn't feel it was appropriate for the show to go on. They didn't announce the news to the live house. Obviously, we know the harrowing footage of Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler having to tell the news on pay-per-view. And obviously, you see in the manner everybody else carries on that something terrible has happened, but they never announced it to the live house. They didn't feel like at the time that it was the right thing to do.
We see a clip from Bret Hart shown here as well, where he chastises WWE for what happened, and Bret says, quote, "If it had been Vince's son Shane splattered on the mat, he wouldn't have let the show go on." Not mincing his words at all there, but I think in this instance we can probably forgive Bret for being very straight talking, because it's a horrific tragedy that happened, of course.
Yeah, and Vince McMahon responds to this and the conversation about it, saying, "The decision I had to make was whether the show goes on. The audience didn't really see what happens. Had they seen, no questions, you would have to shut the show down. Those people came to see a show. They didn't come to see somebody die. And me, as a businessman, it's like, okay, let's continue on. Let's continue the show." There was a lot of negative comments as to whether or not the show should have continued. Had it been me who was splattered on the mat, as Bret said, I would want the show to go on. Get me out of there and let the show go on. I think it's worth reading that quote in its entirety, because I've seen online that shared and the splattered on the mat line attributed to Vince.
As if he came up with it.
As if he came up with it, and really what he was doing was paraphrasing what Bret said. I'm not looking to defend Vince.
We want to defend Vince.
No, I'm not. I just think I think it's just worth on that point, little bit. Yeah. Believe me, there is plenty to talk about when it comes to Vince McMahon, but that quote was, I believe, somewhat shared out of context. I thought it was worth pointing that one out.
Yes. On to episode 5 now, and Paul Heyman says that Vince's life is driven by the overcompensatory behavior rebelling against the first miserable 12 years of his life, and escaping the abuse has been his life pursuit in creating an atmosphere where he's untouchable and invulnerable to outside forces and in control of his own destiny. As you've added there, very cheekily, probably why he wanted to buy this very documentary.
Probably is.
Yeah.
Paul Heyman has some really powerful pieces that he says here in the next couple of episodes in particular about Vince McMahon, the perception of Vince McMahon, and also shares a story coming up. This whole episode is geared around the relationship that Vince has with his children, with Shane and with Stephanie McMahon. He makes reference as well to his upbringing early on that's contained, and I quote, fighting, infighting, and incest. It's mentioned that Vince brought up in a Playboy magazine interview about abuse that he'd received from his mother and his stepfather growing up. He says he's never subscribed to the notion that if you're abused as a kid, then you will go the same way, saying people should throw it the F back there and move forward in typical way that this documentary is put together, as he talks about, like, no reason to go back and be that and move forward and be something different. This is over the top of clips of McMahon verbally and physically assaulting Stephanie and Shane, as well as having some very awkward romantic moments with Trish Stratus, Tori Wilson, and Stacy Keibler.
Yeah. And obviously those matches with Stephanie and Shane, it's all in kayfabe and everything, but it's implying there that, like, is this like an outlet for him? Is he basically Going against what he's just said there. Shane McMahon reveals his journey into the family business as a ring assistant, a referee, and a commentator, before then becoming a character alongside and sometimes against his father. Stephanie shares her story, saying how some people would love her or dislike her based on her wrestling family. She got involved after college, and Triple H suggested the storyline where he drugged and married Stephanie in 1999. I never know whether it was ever revealed whether it was legitimate, in storyline legitimate, or whether Steph was pretending to be asleep and she was in on it all along. Because then suddenly they're all fine with each other and they're the evil couple at the helm of the... It's not the most important thing. It's just something I can never remember. If you know, let me know in the comments.
It was never explained, was it? I kind of get the vibe that maybe he just won her over.
Yeah, that's what I
in the worst of
liked
ways
to think, because Triple H was my favorite back then, and I was like, no, he wouldn't do that.
Of course, they got together in real life and they were going to get married, and Vince McMahon apparently suggested and was really pushing for them to get married on pay-per-view.
Yeah.
That was something that he really wanted to happen, and Stephanie was the one that shot it down, much to the behest of Vince McMahon himself.
It's the most Vince McMahon thing. Vince then booked himself in a match against Stephanie 6 days before her legitimate wedding, and Linda apparently promised to divorce Vince if Steph was left with a black eye on her wedding day.
Now, Vince knew Linda McMahon, who is mentioned at this point, was not a good actress. And that's part of the reason why we enjoy watching those things back from 2001, because they decided the best way to make use of Linda McMahon and her lack of acting skills was to put her in a comatose state in a wheelchair. And it led to the story with Vince McMahon and Trish Stratus as his mistress. Vince said he loved kissing Trish Stratus in front of his wife. Vince says that Shane is a bit more conservative than he is and the rest of the family, and said he had reservations about the storyline taking place.
Oh, Shane, you prude.
Oh, what are you thinking? Let it happen. But of course, it would lead on to a story a match between Vince and Shane.
Yes, the infamous storyline where Vince made Trish get on all fours and bark like a dog is discussed after this. Trish said they knew what they were doing and they knew there would be comeuppance at WrestleMania in that father versus son match. So she seems fine with it as the person in the angle itself, I suppose. That's worth saying, but it still came across, especially in hindsight, really bad.
Yeah, they talk about Sable and the WWF harassment lawsuit that came from her departure as well, because Sable said they were making her do degrading things that she didn't want to do. Vince, in the recent interview, says he doesn't remember the lawsuit, but he says, I do remember that she came back. And they show the clip from SmackDown where Sable is revealed as Stephanie's assistant, and they basically, in front of Sable, talk about the lawsuit of a harassment that Sable put towards WWE, and then they show an intimate moment between Vince and Sable. And bear in mind, throughout all of this, as people who are new to wrestling will have been learning, all these storylines are signed off by Vince McMahon.
And also, I'm sure it was kind of implied around this point that Vince kind of skirts over the Sable thing and doesn't really dwell on it too much. Because I don't really remember the details.
Yeah, he was very casual about it.
Which is bizarre because, I mean, Jim Cornette says a lot of things, but one thing Jim Cornette often says is that he was furious at the time because he wanted to push Sunny as the star of the women's division in WWE, and that Vince McMahon and I think Russo were obsessed with Sable. You know, Sable's the future, and Cornette was like, he's so obsessed with Sable. And in this documentary, Vince is like, I don't really remember Sable very well, and it's just very contradictory, and I don't know which side to buy.
I'm not sure. He's asked about his real life affairs outside of marriage. He was asked if those affairs were ever incorporated into storylines in WWE, to which he denies it. Heyman also says that the only monogamous relationship Vince McMahon has ever had is with his business.
And then we go on to talk about other businesses that he denounced. Well, we do a little bit.
We do a little bit, yikes.
We first talk about WWF floating on the stock exchange, which led to WWF moving to the casino business and the restaurant business, and inevitably buying out WCW. Bruce Pritchard talks about the celebration after buying WCW held on a private jet and says it was pure insanity, but the next day it was business as usual.
The XFL comes up and Vince says that he wasn't really prepared and didn't know anything about football, just saw an opportunity to shake up the Football League and the NFL. It's kind of painted as if like now Vince doesn't have a rival to run up against in wrestling. He'll find somewhere else to find a rival, and it does explain a lot of his mannerisms around that time. Where's my football? NFL's rubbish. This is going to be brilliant. And of course that we knew though the first show got great ratings out of sheer curiosity, and then whenever he realised that the football was bobbins, the ratings dropped and it disappeared.
Bob Costas, who features in multiple episodes in this, but now we talk about the interview with him and Vince, where he
Yeah.
Have a bit of that. And he doesn't say that. But that was discussed. Vince saying he was got by Costas and visualized strangling him when he caught him off guard with some of the tougher questions. Not the most shocking revelation. I was just surprised he was so open about it.
Yeah, and it's funny because obviously we'll see later on that a similar thing happens again in an interview with Vince McMahon, where he gets in the face of the interviewer, and they end up, and Vince will also say later on the fact that he felt attacked, so he was defending and then attacking again.
Yeah, right.
And this is a common thing in these interviews where he goes, and you can see kind of where people say there is no real line between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon because it's all there.
It's that theme again.
Yeah. Hogan,
was it the Costas one with the paper slapping?
It wasn't the Costas one. It was the other one.
It was the other one where he
the Costas one is when he gets all in his face going, you let me finish. You let me finish.
Yes.
It's all up in his grill. Hogan and Rock at WrestleMania leads to Vince sort of reveling in the challenge of bringing back people that said would never work for him or would never work for him again. And they include clips of Eric Bischoff, of Bret Hart in there as well. And from here, Trish then brings us into a story about Vince McMahon's creative control and what it would mean if you didn't play along.
Yeah, she talks about people getting punished for not being on board with creative, talking about a scene where she was going to be making out with a woman, which she didn't think was right for her character. Trish wondered if it was a coincidence that she lost the women's title just the following week for not going along with creative.
There were a few occasions where Vince McMahon creative was halted. One of those is a previously reported bit of scrapped creative that was confirmed by Vince McMahon here. It would have seen Mr. McMahon father Stephanie McMahon's child. Steph shot that down, shockingly. Triple H went on to say that it's quite hard for Stephanie, his wife, to separate Vince the boss, Mr. McMahon the character, and Vince the dad, which are all those things for a long, long time.
We also get Shane's thoughts on this, saying that Vince has always been tough on him, which Vince agrees with because he wants to hold him to a high standard. Stephanie says Vince was easier on her than he was on Shane, and then Bonnie Hammer, the former VP of original programming, says Shane was always the black sheep of the family from her point of view.
There's a lot of conversation throughout this about how there is no line between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon. And this story from Paul Heyman, I think, is one of the strongest examples of that. Paul Heyman tells this story where he says he observed a creative butting of heads between Shane and Vince, which ended with Vince telling Shane, "Not while I'm alive." He then handed Shane a knife from his plate and told Shane if he wanted to make the decision he wanted to make so bad, he'd have to stick the knife in to do it. Vince sort of opening up his jacket as if to go, that's where you hit it. If you don't do it, I know you're not man enough and I have to take that into consideration. Or you can buy me out the way that I bought out my father. And if I don't get out of the way, be prepared to get rid of me the way I would have had to get rid of my father when he wasn't doing things my way. Gee.
It's like something from The Godfather or something.
It's you know, a lot of people say like this is the wrestling version of Inception is just it's so
Succession.
Succession, not Inception.
Yeah.
Succession.
The political inter-family fighting and everything.
And it's one of those stories which again blurs who Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon is, because that very much feels like a Mr. McMahon thing, but maybe if Mr. McMahon and Vince are the same.
On Shane's departure, Vince said Shane left because he felt it was time to leave, but Vince wasn't. He felt it time for Vince to leave, but Vince wasn't going to. Shane says they weren't seeing eye to eye, and he could either stay and watch them implode or step away. He ends by advising people not to bring family into the business.
Final episode.
Yeah.
It's called The Big Finish, and this quote from Vince to start us off. Go on.
I'll read this one.
You can read this bad boy.
This is Vince's quote towards the start of the final episode, which has already done the rounds a bit because it's so bizarre. Vince says, I have two computers in my head and sometimes they work against me. I have one talking to you right now and there's another one thinking something completely different. And then there's a third one sometimes. If I wanted to tap into it, I could. And so it's difficult for me to sometimes pay attention to things. It's bothered me through the years because all I wanted to be was normal. I wanted to fit in. But I deal with it. It doesn't matter whether you want to be this way or you want to be that way. Here's what you are. You're different. be different. And you know the expression F the world? That's basically what he's saying. Be yourself. Don't, be weird if you're weird. And then they asked, what's your other brain thinking about? And he says, probably something about sex. Why? No, not why would you say that? It makes for, it gets the picture across quite well.
The whole thing about having several computers in his head and them thinking different things and how much it bothered him kind of leads me to believe that maybe Vince McMahon has some form of ADHD, because I know that has been how ADHD has been described by some people that I know. The idea that you've got multiple things going on at once and it's difficult to focus and concentrate on them. And I was like, okay, maybe that's what it is. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm also thinking about sex.
Yeah.
So I think there's something else at play there, as well as, or if not, instead of. Then the whole documentary goes on to about Vince working with Donald Trump at WrestleMania. Bob Costa's saying that Trump's public sensibilities are more in line with a wrestler than a politician, which I think, whichever side politically you're on, you can't disagree with, in terms of they even cross-section like Donald Trump doing stuff in the ring, in promos, with some of the stuff he's done at his rallies.
Yeah,
and you kind of see why, in terms of, from that performer standpoint, Vince McMahon and Donald Trump always seem to get on.
Yes. We also talk about another famous storyline, or infamous storyline, of the mid-2000s. Vince pitching the idea of someone killing him on TV, which led to the exploding limo storyline. Brian Gewirtz says he heard Donald Trump called into WWE to check if Vince was okay. The story was then scrapped, obviously, as we all know, in the wake of the Chris Benoit family tragedy. During the Chris Benoit tribute show, details obviously emerged, as we know as wrestling fans, of what actually happened. Chris Benoit being responsible for what happened.
Yeah. Vince comes out with some quotes about this and says there's no correlation between taking steroids and what happened with Chris Benoit. On the incident, he says, human beings are flawed. Chris Benoit went nuts. It happens in every form of life, in everything. That's the only thing I can take away from it. And it once again, and it feels like, and he'll be challenged by this in an interview, as they'll show this in a bit, anything that comes along that is a positive to wrestling, WWE or Vince McMahon kind of WWE and Vince McMahon kind of embrace it. But when it's a negative, that's what that is what it is. That's nothing to do with it.
Yeah. We then hear from someone I'm very glad appeared on this, because who better to get, literally? Chris Nowinski, former WWE superstar, of course, who went on to do extensive studies in concussions in wrestling. He was adamant, by the way Benoit wrestled, that he suffered from CTE, and a study of Benoit's brain proved it. Vince McMahon then says that the CTE study is ridiculous, and all of the head impacts Benoit was making in his matches were just a work. Hulk Hogan drew the comparison of Benoit landing head first throughout his career as the same as Hogan selling a wrist lock. He's saying, oh, Benoit wasn't suffering from all these concussions. He was selling. It's just wrestling. It's not real.
Steve Austin says he can't remember having too many concussions in wrestling. He does cite an occasion where he did have a concussion, but then they showed the footage of Owen Hart pile driving him and breaking his neck, which is slightly different to a concussion. He says if you get a lot of concussions in wrestling, Steve Austin says, you're doing something wrong. Austin says he doesn't believe in CTE. And I'm going to point this out because I couldn't not look at it. And I know that's the documentary designed it in this way. Austin said, I don't believe in CTE. There was a pause. And then he touched his ear like this, which can be.
I really want to do it now. You've made me do it.
Yeah. It's when you look at body language, it can be a self-soothing thing to kind of put you at your ease, relieves anxiety. It can be an indicator of like hear no evil, whereby it's a protective action where either you don't believe what you're hearing or believe what you're saying. It could just be an itchy ear. I'm very aware of that. But I just think the fact that they had that and they lingered on him doing that was an interesting one when they were talking about CTE.
At the very least, they want us to doubt what Austin's saying with the editing.
That is designed to do that. Yes.
Vince McMahon, I mean, it's a crazy thing for Austin to say, in my opinion.
Yes.
Vince apparently approached Chris Nowinski and said he'd like to help if they could come up with honest research. This led to several changes: reduced schedules, concussion monitoring, moving away from chair shots to the head, something that The Undertaker says he was initially upset about. When I think about a lot of famous chair shots to the head, they're either being given or received by The Undertaker.
Yeah, they did show a couple of them, and he felt like this was a storyline method that was now being taken out of the arsenal of professional wrestling. But last time I checked, wrestling is doing fine without chair shots to the head. Somehow it's carrying on. I found it interesting, the fact that the argument was CTE is not real, concussions aren't real, they're not a problem. Come to me with some honest research. So now we've instigated the following measures. As if they go, actually, we found out there is something to it. We see footage of, as we mentioned,
this is the one.
That's the one. Arman Kitayan, who, when asked if the deaths of wrestlers so young falls on his shoulders, McMahon knocks the papers out of Arman's hands. Vince says when he's come at, he can't help but be defensive and then get offensive, which we've already mentioned. He said a lot of the people who died used prescription drugs as recreation along with steroids, and it was a deadly cocktail. And as you mentioned earlier on, it was never explicitly told to the wrestlers to, take steroids, but the implications were always there.
I think in one earlier episode, Bret Hart even says something like, look at all the main event guys. They're all bigger. We need to get there to be main event guys.
Yeah.
We get to WrestleMania 30 and Undertaker's streak coming to an end. Undertaker says Vince told him that night that he was going to lose. And Taker reveals he got concussed and doesn't remember being in the match. Vince then takes issue with this and says he's not convinced that Undertaker got concussed that night. And the reason for the lapse in memory is because he was so traumatized by the streak ending. We then see Vince accompanying Undertaker to hospital after the match, or going along after.
Presumably to get the diagnosis of feeling sad about losing a fake fight.
Yeah.
That's I think he was just upset that the streak was ending. That's why he's forgotten it. Or maybe he landed on his head 20 minutes in and he had a concussion. There's a wild thought. There's lots of changes that come into wrestling at this point, and Cody Rhodes' arrival is kind of seen as like a flag post, a save point, if you will, for changes in the company inside and out, the wellness policy coming in, the product going PG, partly out of fear of sponsors moving away from the very edgy, ruthless aggression products. It led to stock prices going up, sponsorship deals becoming more lucrative. It led to a good time had by all around, and it led to the return of the prodigal son.
Shane McMahon talks about getting a call from Vince to come back in 2016 for WrestleMania 32 and the match with The Undertaker in and atop Hell in a Cell. He says the best bit of his comeback was coming out to the ring with his kids doing the Shane Shuffle. I saw it. Saw that happen.
You saw it live.
Well, we were all going, oh, he's dancing with his kids. That's lovely. He's going to do something horrible. They're going to see him do something horrible. And then he did.
He certainly did. And he talks about how he always went a bit extra in the ring because it was a desire to get the approval of his dad. And of course, we've seen many examples of him going extra. They play the King of the Ring footage of him being thrown through the table and basically antagonizing Kurt Angle to give it socks to get him through there. He says he didn't know that there are many. Vince says, I know that Shane always wanted me to respect him and things of that nature. I don't know if there are many pats on the shoulder in terms of way to go. Maybe there should have been. My dad never said that to me, and that's okay. I've always been proud of Shane for what he's done, what he attempts to do, because he gives it his all.
Now we're into the final stretch of the docuseries, and the topic of Vince retiring comes up. This was shot before Vince retired.
Oh, yes.
He says he never sees himself retiring. I never understand why people stop growing. When you stop growing, you die. Some people are like, I want to retire one day. What are you going to do when you retire? I have no sympathy for people like that. So go die.
Then a bunch of wrestlers are asked whether Vince would ever retire, and they all adamantly say no.
He'll never retire. No.
Booker T then goes, the only time I can see Vince retiring is if a nuclear bomb exploded. Blackout, lights up, the nuclear bomb is massive allegations placed against him. There's no interview footage recorded with Vince from this point on because as the allegations started to come out, he stopped doing interviews for stuff, basically. But Bruce Pritchard's interview was wrapped apparently just a few days before it all got really sour, and we'll talk on that in a little bit. Ted Mann of the Wall Street Journal says an anonymous email was sent to the WWE board to reveal that McMahon was involved with a WWE employee and increased her salary when they began a relationship. And there was a reluctance to speak from anybody internally due to fear of retaliation, that code of silence that maybe Jimmy Hart intimated earlier in the documentary as well.
When the allegations came out, Vince McMahon cancelled the final interviews for the Netflix doc, as we've mentioned. The Wall Street Journal team, who are present throughout this, kind of in the background, they occasionally speak and stuff, but now they become very important. They talk about the intentional blurring of Vince McMahon the person and Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon the character, as well as stories within WWE. Meltzer points out that after allegations were made of Vince being inappropriate with a tanning salon employee, WWE ran a storyline involving Mickie James making up a story that she'd been attacked by a male she was on a date with, as if kind of rubbishing these real life claims in kayfabe, in storyline.
That's kind of what it felt like.
It certainly did.
You hear some speculation and some reports that say that is still a practice somewhat done today, where they had the story with Logan Paul threatening a lawsuit. Was done at the same time as the Vince McMahon lawsuit stuff was coming out, and it was potentially done to alter the search engine, the SEO.
Right.
So therefore, if you search WWE lawsuit, it would potentially push other things up there.
I saw people mention that about Liv Morgan as well, and her storyline with Dominic Mysterio. I don't know if that one was more coincidence. I don't know how similar that could have been to real life stuff. But it could well have been as well. You never know.
The allegations around a former wrestler, who obviously we understand to be Ashley Mazzaro, are discussed here. And as these stories start to come out, we see Vince McMahon retiring from WWE, which leads to Stephanie McMahon leading that really weird tribute on SmackDown.
Very awkward.
Getting people to say thank you, Vince, at the start of the show.
Cody Rhodes describes the locker room reaction and about the uncertainty about how the company would look without Vince McMahon. Hulk Hogan said he was adamant the business wouldn't survive without him.
In 2022, Hulk Hogan said that. It was still here. Yeah. We moved to January, Vince McMahon's return as exec chairman and the resignation of Stephanie McMahon. Cody said that he wasn't surprised that Vince returned, but was surprised that other people were. It's also worth pointing out at this point in the documentary that as Stephanie McMahon's resignation tweet is shared in the doc, it's a Cultaholic news video they're playing.
They play audio of Adam Pacitti talking.
Yeah. So Adam Pacitti makes it into the Mr. McMahon documentary, and by process, so do we.
Well, kind of.
By default, so do we. So Adam does indeed pop up in the documentary from there as well.
Bruce Pritchard is re-interviewed in 2024 after the allegations have come out, and is asked his thoughts, or was re-interviewed in 2024 and was asked his thoughts on the episodes of the documentary that he'd seen so far. Presumably he had he got a chance to look at some of it early because he was involved
in
with
the same way that Vince McMahon had seen it earlier, and that was what led to him going, "Can I just buy this, please?"
Right. Okay.
So there was people within WWE who had seen the first couple of episodes, and this was Bruce Pritchard being interviewed after he'd seen them.
And he said, "I thought the episode sucked. I didn't think it was balanced. I thought it was portrayed as a gotcha piece or a hit piece. I'm close to it and it's personal to me." He basically goes on to say the documentary misses the human side of Vince and referenced how Vince looked after Bruce's wife when she had cancer and paid for the best care available. He concludes by saying, "It wasn't a documentary on Vince and Vince's life and Vince's story. It was, see what an asshole Vince McMahon is. Let's see how big of a one we can make him. And if he were one, I would support that. But he's not," says Bruce Pritchard.
And then 2 days later, as it says on the screen, this is where the Janelle Grant allegations come out towards Vince McMahon. The Wall Street Journal reporter, Khadija Safdar, says that she felt people at WWE were surprised by the allegations, and they came to her as a tip-off because a lot of the prior news that she'd reported and investigated were around trafficking and misconduct allegations, so that's why it landed on her desk.
The message put across at this point is very much that WWE has been thriving without Vince McMahon, which you could argue that it has, setting records for live gate, merchandise, and social media engagement, and all that sort of businessy stuff.
When it comes to Vince's legacy, Undertaker, Booker T, Trish Stratus, and John Cena all struggle to answer the question. But Tony Atlas just goes, "Yeah, he'll be remembered as the greatest promoter of all time. Not the best of persons, obviously." Vince says on his own legacy, "I don't have one. People really don't know me at all. And a lot of people have confused me with who I am on television."
Now, it's important to remember what Vince said there, because the final moments of the doc seem to show him saying something completely contradictory to that. And it goes back to this common thread throughout of blurring the lines, or what's Vince McMahon and what's Mr. McMahon, the character. He says sometimes what happens is performers start believing in themselves. They start believing in their own character. The individual loses all sense of who they are. Personally, they become the character. I'm wondering myself now, which is the character and which is me? I guess maybe it's a blend, and I would suggest one is exaggerated a little bit, but I'm not sure which one.
And bear in mind that earlier on, a few episodes before that, Vince McMahon had said, "Oh, there's nothing similar between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon."
So yeah, a lot there. I think a lot of it is a history of WWE, condensed and edited really, really well for people who don't have a clue about WWE. But also there are stuff for wrestling fans to find in here as well.
The last half an hour is the bit that I think a lot of people will laser focus on, because this goes into the current legal situation and the allegations around Vince McMahon. But there is a massive elephant in the room here, because there is no mention of the fact that Janelle Grant's lawsuit is also at WWE. And there is no mention of John Laurinaitis at all throughout this documentary. The focus is very much on the story of Vince McMahon and his allegations and his practices, which absolutely are coming to light, and absolutely, if these allegations are the case, should be investigated and the right thing should be done. But I found it interesting that those were omissions, and I do wonder if WWE weren't about to launch on Netflix, would the story there have been slightly more open? Because I think the vibe they want to get, and that line in there in the last episode where they talk about how, you know, since Vince McMahon has gone, we're doing more money than ever, we're selling out more than ever, biggest gate since 2002. I wonder whether that's the point of all this. He's like, these times were great, this man was terrible, but there's bright roads ahead. Yeah. Come watch us on Netflix.
It did end sort of on that tone, didn't it? And then back to Vince for one last bit. I wonder, because there's two sides, isn't there? On one hand, you could say that WWE, in their own perfect world, would want everybody to just forget that Vince McMahon ever existed. They probably wouldn't want this documentary to be out there. But on the other hand, like you say, it's gonna get WWE's name in more people's mouths who otherwise wouldn't watch WWE. They're gonna see this documentary with all this crazy history and all the controversy and everything, and they're gonna think, well, I want a piece of that. I want to get involved, because even though it deals with some horrible things and some horrible allegations, it grabs attention, and the general public watching Netflix, who would never have watched wrestling otherwise, might go, yes, I want more of this drama, basically. And especially now that they've, in the documentary, presented a clean break between the Vince era and the glorious, entertaining future.
Yes, the Paul Levesque era, which is on the way.
I get what you're saying there, and I think it's a very good point.
What's interesting is, as well, in terms of how this documentary came to life, it was a documentary that Vince McMahon wanted to do, according to reports from the director, who said that, inspired by the Andre the Giant documentary, Vince McMahon wanted a piece done about him and the media giant that he created. And of course, when they set out to put this together, that was certainly what they were doing. But events in 2022 onwards absolutely changed the focus of that. And then once it's all underway, then there's no going back. You can't ignore it. And then all of a sudden, this documentary changed shape overnight because of these things.
Yeah.
And they covered it the best they could, I think.
I think so as well. And again, I think that non-wrestling fans' view of this documentary could differ wildly from our view of it, which is quite a well-done history of it, dealing with a lot of Vince stuff, and then there's some new things to find as well, some little nuggets of info here and there that we've gone into. But I think non-wrestling fans, if you're going to watch this, watch it with a non-wrestling fan friend of yours, because I think they'll have their minds blown by the crazy world that we're all weirdly just familiar with now.
The sheer amount of stuff in there is unbelievable. And of course, your thoughts on the documentary, let us know down below. Stay safe. Love you. Bye.